So Luigi, now that you have a Commodore 64, I feel like I should tell you a little bit about them. So I'm going to tell you, just like I did before, a little bit about Commodore, who they were and what they did. So Commodore is an American company, first American company that we're going to cover, probably the only American company that we'll cover in this series.
Okay.
And they formed in 1976. It was a guy called Jack Tramiel, who is a guy who used to make typewriters before computers, so it kind of makes sense he moved into that. And Jack was accompanied by a guy called Irving Gould as a business partner. They formed Commodore in 1976. They made a couple of earlier computers, the Commodore PET and the VIC-20. I don't know how carefully you just looked at the box that we just opened.
It says VIC-20 on it.
It says VIC-20. A few of the games are actually VIC-20 games on there, and you can actually boot the computer up as a VIC-20 instead of a Commodore 64. But really, the Commodore 64 is the one that most people know. It's actually the largest selling single model of computer ever. They think somewhere between 15 and 30 million of them were sold, but they don't know for sure, which far outstrips any of the other models of computer. And obviously not consoles. There's consoles I think that have sold more, but in terms of computers, biggest ever still.
Yeah, I thought you were talking about, when you said computers, I was thinking of you thinking of electronics, so I went, surely there's more phones.
Yeah, absolutely, there will be more. Although I don't know individual models of phone because they update so often. I'm not sure. We could look into it. So what was different about the Commodore and the other computers? Well, Commodore had a couple of advantages going. So firstly, they actually bought a chip manufacturer called MOS, M-O-S. Yeah, MOS Technologies they bought, and that meant that they had control of the chips that were being supplied to put into the Commodore, which was the MOS 6510 at the time. And they also had something which the others didn't have, which was a really good video chip called the VIC-2, and there was a really good sound chip called the SID chip. So when we play some games on the Commodore, you should notice that they've got much better sound on them. Okay, so they did really, really well, made one of the best selling computers ever, and then things started to unravel for them. So in 1984 they were like on top of their game. I think it was 1985 or 1986 Jack Tramiel left Commodore and he actually bought Atari. You've heard of Atari before? Yeah, they did some earlier consoles as well. So Atari actually came out with a new microcomputer called the Atari ST, and at the same time Commodore was trying to do something with a company called Amiga to make Amiga computers. So you might have heard of Atari ST and Amiga before.
I've heard of Amiga.
Yeah, so they got into a little bit of a battle, but ultimately neither of those computers really did quite as well as the Commodore 64 had done commercially, at least. And then they went into the normal downward spiral that a lot of the others went into, where they started to create later versions of the 8-bit computers. They had the Commodore 128. They had other variants called the Educator 64, which was like a one for schools, which didn't do very well. There was something called the SX 64, which was like a portable Commodore 64 effectively. And they even did a console, like all of them tried at some point, and that fell flat on its face. I think they shipped about 20,000 of those and only sold 2,000 of them, so it didn't do very well at all. So I think it was like mid-90s before the Commodore name eventually went bankrupt, but so they kept it going for a long time, but their heyday really, I would say, was the very late 70s to the mid-80s. All right?
Yeah.
Great, so now we're going to have a look at one of those components from the microcomputer architecture that we talked about. You know, we looked at the CPU last time. Well, now we're going to go into our next section of how does it work.